Once you have everything drawn out, you are going to be ready to start painting. And you may have a watercolor set like this with individual pan colors, or you may have a watercolor set like this with multiple colors. No matter which set you're using, we are only going to use the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, to make our color wheel, because this is going to be all about practicing mixing the colors. So if you have this set, you will have to, of course, mix your own colors because you only have the primary colors. However, if you have a set like this, you are going to have some of the secondary colors, but I don't want you to use them because that's not really going to teach you how to mix them yourself. So I'm going to rely on you guys to practice this skill and mix them from primary colors only. So you should also have your watercolor brush, a paper towel to work with, and a water cup with fresh clean water in a jar or a cup that's not going to be used for food. And we're going to be painting our color wheel in a very specific order. First, all we're going to paint are the primary colors, yellow, red, and blue. If you have this tray, you'll be mixing on your palette here. If you have a tray like this that has a lid, you'll be mixing on your lid. And be very, very careful about making sure that you don't accidentally sling paint onto your paper as you're mixing. I am going to bring my tray over underneath the camera just so you can see what I'm mixing. But for you working at home, make sure you keep this off to the side where you won't accidentally splash and get paints on your color wheel. So I'm going to start with my very first color, yellow. And if your yellow has any other colors that have been mixed into it on accident from previous painting sessions, just take a wet brush and swirl that around that top layer, and that will lift off any of those other colors. And rinse your brush until you have a nice, clean, bright yellow, because we want this yellow to be as pure and vibrant as we can get it for our color wheel. So I'm going to start by taking some of this yellow, getting a nice saturated brush full, and use this space on the side on my mixing tray to load and pull some of that color over there too. Now I want to make sure that I have enough water and that it's a nice bright vibrant yellow so that I have enough pigment as well. So to sort of show you what I mean when I'm talking about your water to paint ratio, if I create a little practice value scale on a scrap sheet of paper, you can see that the more water and less paint, the lighter the color is. But the more paint that I add to it with less water is going to create a darker, richer, more vibrant color. So you really want to experiment with this. You can try this out yourself on a scrap sheet of paper to just get a feel for it. It really just takes practice. But we want to be using colors that are on this darker end of this value spectrum today as we're painting our color wheel. Watercolors are notorious for drying lighter than they are when you first paint them. So everything that you paint is going to be a little bit lighter later on. So you want to make sure that you start with a nice, rich, dark color like on the left-hand side. So I'm going to start. I like to always just edge in my painting section. This is going to be all about precision and carefully watching the edges and making sure you stay inside the lines. And so just very, very carefully, I'm going to paint that section, painting right up to my edges, trying very hard not to go over them. So I like to turn my brush to where I can see the edges of the bristles, to see where they're running along the edge of my section, the edge of my pie slice, and turn my hand to where I can see that edge. I don't ever want to paint with the underside of the brush, painting the edges. I always want to see the point of the bristles creating that edge. That way I can make sure I'm not going over. And when you get to that inside section, just be very careful as you paint that section in. Now once you've edged in this portion, I'm going to come back through and very gently fill this space in. Now if your brush runs out of color, go back to your palette, lift up some more, and continue painting. With watercolors, you want to paint very nice, smooth strokes of color. You don't necessarily want to dig and brush back and forth. You want to lay down your color and leave it alone. See if there are any touch-ups that you need to make. And then we're going to leave that section alone and let it dry. Now I'm going to rinse my brush really well in my water cup and move on to my red. Now, depending on your tray, you may have multiple different types of reds. So you can use anything on the outside of your circle as a way to test your colors. I'm not sure exactly which red I want to use, so I'm going to test them out. This red, that's like a really nice magenta. And then if I try this red, this one is a nice bright fire engine truck red. So a lot of times in watercolor sets, if you have two different types of a color, you may end up with a warm and a cool version of it. So for just my pure red, the color of those two that's the closest to bright red is that warmer red that looks more like a fire engine truck red. So that's the one that I'm gonna paint in my red section. Now, one thing that you do want to be careful of is making sure that you don't ever rest your hand in any of the other paints while they're drying. So you may have to turn, move yourself around your table or turn your hand at a different angle to make sure that you don't rest your hand in wet paint, because if you do, it will smear. So once you finish painting your primary colors, you are going to let them completely dry. Now don't do what I did, which is as soon as I finished, I accidentally smeared red paint all over my painting. So I unfortunately had to stop and restart and completely redo my painting up until this point. So don't make the same mistake that I did. Don't smear your paint if you can help it, but let this dry for about 10 or 15 minutes. While you're waiting for that to dry, take your water cup and rinse it out. Anytime your water gets dingy and dirty from paint, it's going to create dingy and dirty colors. So whenever your water is dirty, just dump that water out and get yourself nice, fresh, clean water while you're waiting for this paint to dry. So now you can, if you want to clean your palette, you can rinse your palette off to give yourself some new clean mixing space now that we're going to mix our secondary colors. So I just rinse all that with my wet brush and clean that off with a paper towel. So next we're going to mix our secondary colors, and those are going to be directly in between two primary colors. So in theory, they should be, if I'm mixing orange, for example, 50% yellow and 50% red. They should be a nice, perfect, even balance right in between those two primary colors, with violet, red and blue, and green, yellow, and blue. But I will tell you one trick. Yellow is the lightest color on the color wheel, and it is very light, which also makes it very easily overpowered. So whenever you are mixing a color with yellow, like green or orange, do sort of know that you typically have to end up putting more yellow in it to balance out the red or the blue, just because those colors are much more powerful than the yellow. Now, your paint tray may have secondary colors on it, but I don't want you to use those because that's not really going to teach you anything or get you to practice a skill and get better. So I want you to mix your own secondary colors, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So if I start with orange, I'm going to try to find a nice middle of the road orange. So I'm going to grab some yellow, and I typically start with a lot of the yellow and pull it down here to my paint tray. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit less of my red and start mixing those together. So that looks pretty good, but I need to test it first and see if it's going to work. So anywhere that's on the outside of your circle, you can use that as an area to create a little test swatch. Now, if I look at that, I'm going to try to see and ask myself if it is perfectly centered between yellow and red. And the reason for that is because I need to make sure I have enough room to have a nice distinct yellow-orange and a nice distinct red-orange later on. So right now, I actually think that leans too close to yellow, so I'm going to add a little bit more red and test it again. That's getting better. And I'm just going to slowly adjust that color. Now, for example, let's say I accidentally grab way too much red, and now I've gone in the other direction. All I have to do is add more yellow. So it's sort of just a back and forth between those two colors until you get that nice, happy, medium middle of the road. And just test your color out. I think that looks about right. That's getting closer. Until you're sure that you have a really good secondary color. Now, everything that's on the outside here will get cut off, so that those tester swatches, make as many as you need to get the color right before you paint it in here. So for green, I'm going to start with yellow. And I'm trying to make sure I don't get the yellow that has the orange mixed into it. So start with a nice pure yellow. And then add little bits of your blue. The blue is going to be really powerful, so just a tiny bit of blue really goes a long way. And then you can test your color and see what adjustments you need to make. Actually, I think that looks really pretty good, that first try. Okay, so now that I have my orange and green painted, the last one I'm going to paint today is my violet. For a violet, because violet is over here in the cooler section of the color wheel, Mixing it with a cool red, like this magenta red, will actually make a much prettier violet than the warm red. So for example, if I take some of my blue and I take this warm red, it is going to make a violet, but it's going to be just a lot duller, just not really very vibrant. So I want to show you what that looks like. There you can see that violet. It's much darker. Now if I rinse that and use the cooler red, the more magenta one, you'll immediately see the difference in the vibrancy of this color. It's much, much prettier and much more pure. So if you have that option, use a cool red instead of a warm red. So once you finish painting your secondary color, we're going to let this totally dry, and then we're going to finish painting the tertiary colors in between those tomorrow.